You probably recognize this pattern because it shows up quietly at work, in business, and in relationships. Wherever people are expected to play by the same rules. You do what you said you would do. You keep your word even when it costs you, and you assume that if you stay reasonable, the situation will remain reasonable too. But over time, something starts to feel wrong because the people around you bend the rules, cut corners, or take more than they give, and nothing seems to happen to them. There are no consequences, no correction, no moment where the system pushes back and restores balance, while you are expected to be patient, flexible, and understanding. So you adjust, you compromise again, you explain calmly, you give the benefit of the doubt, and each time you do, you give up a little more ground. This is not a one-time event or a rare mistake. It is a pattern that repeats itself across different environments and different stages of life. The person who ignores the rules appears to move faster, while the person who plays clean keeps falling behind, not because they are weaker, but because they are predictable. Eventually, a quiet and uncomfortable question begins to form, one you rarely say out loud because it feels almost dangerous to ask. If fairness is supposed to be the right way to live, why does it keep placing the same people at a disadvantage when the stakes actually matter? Why does being reasonable begin to feel less like strength and more like something others learn to exploit once they realize there is no price to pay? And the most difficult question of all is this: if playing fair is meant to work, why does it fail so often in the real world? Pause here, because the answer has little to do with morality and nothing to do with you being naive or weak. It has everything to do with how situations are structured, how incentives are arranged, and what happens when fairness is not protected by consequences. Before we talk about fairness itself, we need to talk about the kind of game you are actually playing. If this is your first time here, ThinkMate is where we question what others accept. That's the kind of mind we build this channel for. Subscribe if you want more. Now, back to it. Most people grow up believing that fairness is natural, almost automatic, as if the world itself prefers balance and quietly corrects those who take too much. From an early age, we are taught that playing fair is not just moral, but practical, because sooner or later the system is supposed to reward those who do the right thing. Follow the rules, respect others, be reasonable, and eventually things will work out, not because of luck, but because fairness is assumed to be built in. But that belief begins to crack the moment you notice how often unfair behavior goes unpunished, while fairness itself quietly absorbs the cost. In real situations, there is no invisible referee stepping in, no neutral force restoring balance, and no automatic mechanism that protects the reasonable from being exploited. The world does not pause to ask who was fair, who was patient, or who tried to do the right thing before deciding who moves forward. Instead, outcomes tend to follow incentives, not intentions, and behavior adjusts to whatever the situation quietly allows. If cutting corners carries no cost, some people will cut them, not because they are evil, but because the environment makes it profitable. If exploiting patience leads to better results, patience slowly stops being a virtue and starts becoming a liability. Fairness, in other words, does not protect itself, and it does not survive on good intentions alone. It only works when something actively enforces it, when there is memory, consequence, and the possibility of response. Remove those conditions and fairness stops functioning as a stabilizing force, even among people who genuinely prefer cooperation. This is why the same person can behave fairly in one situation and ruthlessly in another without changing who they are. The difference is not character, but structure, because behavior follows the shape of the environment more closely than we like to admit. Once you see this, it becomes harder to explain repeated losses as bad luck or personal failure. It raises a more uncomfortable possibility that fairness is not a universal rule of life, but a fragile arrangement that only survives under specific conditions. To understand those conditions, we need a way to look at decisions without morality, without intention, and without comforting stories. And that is exactly where the analysis begins. There is a reason this pattern keeps repeating across different situations, and it is not because people suddenly became worse or more selfish than before. For decades, economists and strategists have studied what happens when individuals must choose between cooperation and self-interest, without assuming anyone is good or bad. They were not trying to explain morality or justify behavior, but to understand a simpler question: what people tend to do when outcomes depend on each other. This approach eventually became known as game theory, not because it involves games, but because it treats real situations as structured interactions with rules, choices, and consequences. Game theory looks at decisions the way a chessboard looks at moves, not by judging intent, but by observing what different options make possible. It asks what happens if one person cooperates while the other does not. What happens if both cooperate, and what happens if neither does? More importantly, it asks how behavior changes over time, once people realize what is rewarded, what is punished, and what is quietly ignored. This way of thinking was formalized in the mid-20th century by mathematician John von Neumann, whose work laid the foundation for analyzing strategic decision-making. His book, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, published in 1944, became a blueprint for studying conflict, cooperation, and incentives without relying on moral assumptions. Since then, game theory has been applied to economics, warfare, politics, negotiations, and any situation where one person's choice affects another's outcome. What makes this framework uncomfortable is that it removes intention from the explanation and focuses entirely on structure. It suggests that people do not behave fairly because fairness is good, but because fairness works under certain conditions. And when those conditions disappear, behavior changes, even among people who believe in fairness. To see why, we need to look at one of the simplest and most revealing situations game theory ever analyzed. To understand why fairness collapses so easily, game theory begins with a situation that is deliberately simple, because complexity often hides the truth instead of revealing it. Imagine two people who must make a decision at the same time, without knowing what the other person will choose, and without being able to communicate beforehand. Each person has only two options: cooperate with the other person, or act in their own immediate self-interest. If both people cooperate, the outcome is decent for both of them, not perfect, but stable, predictable, and better than conflict. If one person cooperates while the other does not, the one who defects gains more in the short term, while the cooperative person pays the price. And if both people choose to defect, the outcome is worse for both than if they had cooperated, but neither risks being taken advantage of. This situation is known as the prisoner's dilemma, not because it is about prisoners, but because it exposes a tension that appears in real life again and again. The dilemma is simple. Cooperation creates the best shared outcome, but defection offers protection against being exploited. When people face this situation only once, defection often feels like the safer choice, because cooperation carries the risk of being the only one who plays fair. In a single encounter, fairness is fragile because it depends entirely on trust, and trust has no backup when there is no second chance. This is where many people stop thinking about the problem, assuming that the lesson is simply that people are selfish and that fairness is unrealistic. But game theory does not stop there, because real life is rarely a single interaction with no future consequences. Most relationships, workplaces, and systems involve repeated encounters where today's behavior affects tomorrow's response. So the question shifts from what happens once to what happens when the same people face this decision over and over again. If you know you will meet the same person again, your choice changes, because cooperation today might lead to cooperation tomorrow. Likewise, defection today might invite retaliation later, creating a cost that does not appear in a one-time interaction. This is where the problem becomes far more interesting, because fairness suddenly has a chance to survive, but only under specific conditions. To see whether it actually does, researchers did not rely on intuition or philosophy, but turned the problem into an experiment. And the results of that experiment would change how cooperation is understood forever. Instead of guessing how people might behave over time, a political scientist named Robert Axelrod decided to test the problem in the most controlled way possible. Axelrod was not interested in morality or ideology, but in a simple question: whether cooperation could survive when individuals were free to exploit each other. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he organized a series of computer tournaments based on the prisoner's dilemma, but with one crucial change. The game was no longer played once, it was played repeatedly, with the same opponents meeting again and again over many rounds. Axelrod invited researchers from different disciplines to submit strategies, each one encoded as a computer program that decided when to cooperate and when to defect. Some strategies were aggressive, defecting immediately and never cooperating, while others were generous, cooperating regardless of how they were treated. A few strategies tried to be clever, using complex calculations to predict future moves and maximize short-term gains. Each strategy played against every other strategy, round after round, accumulating points based on the outcomes of each interaction. At the end of the tournament, Axelrod expected that the most sophisticated or aggressive strategies would dominate the field. But that is not what happened. The strategy that performed best was almost embarrassingly simple. So simple that many initially assumed it must be incomplete. This strategy followed just 4 basic rules. It started by cooperating. It responded by copying the opponent's last move. It punished defection immediately, and it returned to cooperation once the opponent did. Axelrod called this strategy tit for tat, not as a joke, but as a precise description of how it behaved. Tit for tat never attacked first, which allowed cooperation to emerge, but it never allowed exploitation to go unanswered. When faced with a cooperative opponent, it created stable mutual benefit, and when faced with a defector, it imposed an immediate cost. Most importantly, it did not hold grudges, because the moment the opponent returned to cooperation, tit for tat did the same. Over many rounds, this simple behavior produced a powerful result. Cooperative strategies could outperform purely selfish ones, but only if they could respond. Strategies that always defected gained short-term advantages, but were eventually punished by retaliation and lost opportunities for long-term cooperation. Strategies that always cooperated were quickly exploited and consistently underperformed, regardless of how fair or well-intentioned they were. Tit for tat succeeded not because it was nice, but because it was clear, consistent, and capable of responding to what actually happened. Axelrod summarized these findings in his 1984 book, The Evolution of Cooperation, which showed that cooperation could emerge without central authority. But the cooperation he described was not based on trust or goodwill. It was based on memory, consequence, and the expectation of future interaction. Cooperation survived because defection was no longer free, and because behavior today shaped behavior tomorrow. However, Axelrod was careful to point out something many people missed when they later simplified his conclusions. Tit for tat only worked when the game had specific properties: repeated interaction, the ability to recognize opponents, and the capacity to respond. Remove those conditions and the strategy collapses, no matter how fair or reasonable the individuals involved may be. In environments where interactions are brief, anonymous, or consequence-free, cooperation does not evolve. It erodes. Axelrod's work did not prove that fairness always wins. It proved that fairness requires a structure that protects it. Without memory, there is no accountability. Without accountability, there is no incentive to cooperate. And without incentive, fairness becomes a liability. This distinction is critical because many people assume they are losing because they are playing the strategy incorrectly. But Axelrod's experiments suggest a more uncomfortable possibility, that the strategy may be sound, while the environment makes it impossible to succeed. Once you understand this, the question is no longer whether fairness is good or bad. The question becomes whether the conditions that allow fairness to function actually exist in the real world. And that is where the problem truly begins. At this point, the problem should start to feel familiar, because the conditions Axelrod described rarely exist in the places where fairness fails the most. In the real world, interactions are often brief, fragmented, and anonymous, which means memory is weak and consequences are delayed or never arrive. People move between jobs, teams, markets, and platforms so quickly that yesterday's behavior is often disconnected from today's outcome. When someone defects, exploits, or cuts corners, there is no guarantee they will ever face the same person again. And even when they do, systems are often designed to absorb the damage quietly, rather than assign responsibility or enforce correction. This is where fairness begins to lose its footing, not because people suddenly abandon their values, but because the structure no longer supports them. Without reliable memory, unfair behavior cannot be tracked, and without tracking, there can be no consistent response. Without consistent response, defection becomes cheap, and cheap defection spreads quickly once others see that it works. In these environments, playing fair starts to resemble unilateral disarmament, where one side follows the rules while the other learns that the rules are optional. The problem is not that fairness stops being virtuous, but that it stops being functional. Axelrod's experiments never claimed that cooperation would survive anywhere, under any circumstances. They showed that cooperation is conditional, fragile, and dependent on structure more than intention. Once those conditions are removed, the outcome is predictable. Fairness erodes, exploitation increases, and those who remain reasonable pay the cost. This is why many people feel as if they are doing everything right, yet falling further behind with each compromise they make. The rules they are following no longer match the game they are actually in. And once you see this mismatch clearly, the next step is unavoidable. You have to identify exactly how and where the game changes, because each type of breakdown creates a different kind of loss. That is where the real lessons begin. The first lesson is that fairness collapses when you are playing the wrong type of game, because fairness is built for repeated interactions, not one-time encounters with no future. In a repeated game, what you do today shapes how people treat you tomorrow. But in a one-shot game, tomorrow does not exist, so trust has no protection. That is why fairness can feel powerful in a small town, a tight team, or a long partnership where people remember what happened and reputation matters. But fairness weakens in places where people rotate constantly, disappear after taking advantage, or interact through systems that hide identity and history. Think about online marketplaces, corporate restructures, short-term contracts, or any environment where someone can burn a bridge and still find a new road. In that world, being fair does not create safety, because the other person does not need your trust tomorrow, so they only calculate what they can get today. This is why you can do everything right, follow every norm, and still lose, because you are using a long game strategy inside a short game environment. If you do not recognize the difference, you will keep asking the wrong question, thinking you must refine your behavior when the real problem is the structure. The correct question is not whether fairness is good, but whether the situation even allows fairness to function, because some games punish anyone who plays as if there will be a next round. The second lesson is that cooperation fails when defection is cheap, because cooperation only survives when unfair behavior carries a cost that people can actually feel. Axelrod's result was not that being nice wins, but that responsiveness wins, because a system that cannot respond teaches everyone that rules are optional. In real life, cheap defection looks like taking credit for someone else's work. missing deadlines without consequence, breaking promises and blaming circumstances, or extracting favors without returning them. At first, only a few people do it, but once others see it works, the behavior spreads. Not because everyone becomes evil, but because the environment rewards it. This is why the most cooperative person in the room often becomes the default provider, because the group learns they will cover the cost to keep things moving. Economists describe this pattern with public goods problems where everyone benefits from cooperation, but each individual is tempted to free ride. The free rider gets the benefit without paying the cost, and the fair person pays the cost while receiving the same benefit, which slowly turns fairness into a tax. Over time, you do not need a villain to destroy cooperation. You only need a system where exploitation is profitable and unpunished, because incentives do the recruiting for you. So the practical point is not to become distrustful of everyone, but to understand that fairness is a fragile equilibrium that collapses when defection becomes the cheaper and safer move. The third lesson is the hidden cost of fairness, because fairness is not self-sustaining, and maintaining it always requires someone to absorb friction. In a healthy environment, the cost is distributed through norms, consequences, and mutual correction. So no single person carries the entire burden of keeping things fair. But in unhealthy environments, the cost concentrates because the same reasonable people keep stepping forward to fix what others break, smooth what others roughen, and cover what others neglect. This creates a quiet form of exploitation that looks respectable because it is packaged as responsibility, maturity, leadership, or being the bigger person. You become the one who mediates, the one who compromises, the one who follows through, the one who holds the standard, while others learn they can remain careless. Researchers call this a second-order free rider problem, because not only do people free ride on cooperation, they also free ride on enforcement itself. Everyone wants the benefits of a fair environment, but fewer people want to pay the social cost of confronting unfairness, creating boundaries, or imposing consequences. So the burden shifts to the minority who still care, and that minority begins to feel exhausted, resentful, and strangely isolated, even while doing everything they were told is right. This is why fairness starts to feel expensive, because it is, and the bill is often paid by the same people repeatedly, until they either harden, collapse, or quietly withdraw. The fourth lesson is the most difficult one, because it goes against the myth that perseverance and loyalty always redeem the situation. Sometimes the reason you keep losing is not that you are making poor moves, but that you are staying too long in a game that no longer rewards fair play. If the system does not remember behavior, does not punish defection, and does not respond to honesty, then playing better does not change the outcome, it only increases your exposure. In those environments, more patience becomes more permission, more compromise becomes more demand, and more fairness becomes a signal that you can be pushed without consequence. This is where the most rational move is not to negotiate harder inside the same structure, but to remove yourself from the structure entirely. Albert Hirschman framed this with a simple idea. When voice cannot correct the system, exit becomes the only remaining signal that has force. Walking away is not a moral failure, it is a recognition that cooperation requires conditions, and when those conditions are absent, your fairness becomes a resource others consume. That is why staying can be the most expensive choice, because you pay the cost repeatedly while hoping the game will change, even though the game has no reason to change. Put these 4 lessons together, and the picture becomes clearer. Fairness breaks down in the real world because many real environments remove memory, consequence, and meaningful repetition. The uncomfortable implication is that you can be fair and still lose, not because fairness is wrong, but because fairness is not protected by the structure you are inside. Once you see that, your experience stops looking like personal failure and starts looking like a predictable outcome of incentives and design. And that forces the final question. Not whether you should keep being fair, but whether the environment you are in still deserves your cooperation at all. At this point, the problem should look different, because nothing in this story suggests that fairness itself is foolish or outdated. What it shows instead is that fairness is conditional, and those conditions are quietly disappearing in many parts of modern life. Game theory does not say that being fair is wrong, immoral, or naive. It says something colder and far less comforting. It says that fairness only functions when it is protected by memory, consequence, and the expectation of future interaction. When those protections are removed, fairness does not disappear immediately. It slowly turns into a liability carried by the same people over and over again. This is why playing fair can feel exhausting, not because you lack strength, but because you are absorbing costs that the system no longer distributes. It is also why unfair behavior can appear to win, not because it is superior, but because the environment silently rewards it. Once you understand this, the story changes, because your repeated losses stop looking like personal flaws or failures of character. They begin to look like predictable outcomes inside structures that no longer support the values they continue to demand. That realization does not tell you what to do next, and it is not meant to. It simply removes the illusion that fairness will protect itself, or that persistence alone will eventually correct the imbalance. The world does not guarantee that doing the right thing will be rewarded, especially when the cost of doing the wrong thing is low. And that is the part most people avoid seeing, because it is easier to question yourself than to question the structure you are inside. But once you see how the game actually works, you cannot unsee it. You start to recognize when fairness is being supported and when it is being quietly consumed. And that is why, for so many people, playing fair keeps failing, not because fairness is wrong, but because the game has changed. If this hit too close to home, write "fair" in the comments and tell me where playing fair has been costing you the most.